first thanking Liz and UC Extension for making this possible. It is true that I've been teaching there for a long time. And what's really cool is that a lot of the ideas in Vex, Hex, Smash, Smooch, and in the new edition of Sin and Syntax, which is coming out in September, were actually developed in classes at UC Berkeley Extension. So Extension students were my guinea pigs in a way. So I owe a great debt in all of my work to UC Berkeley Extension. I have to find out a little bit about this amazingly large audience who would turn out on the most beautiful, perfect California day we can imagine for a lecture on grammar. What is wrong with you folks? I'm dying to know how many of you are students at any level, yeah. And how many of you are Cal alums? Excellent, me too. I need to raise my hand. And how many of you are writers or want to be writers? Excellent. Any editors in the house? Yes, great. And how many of you are here for none of those reasons above, but because you just have this kind of always undying curiosity about this weird language, English? Okay, cool, excellent. Helpful for me to know. I, too, have that weird, undying fascination with English. I'm going to tell you just a tad about myself to explain how it is that I ended up writing the books that I've written and the sensibility that informs some of what I'm going to talk to you about today. I grew up on the north shore of Oahu in Hawaii, in a little sugar plantation town. We didn't speak English in my town. We didn't speak standard English. We spoke Pidgin English, which is what we called Hawaiian Creole. The linguists call it Hawaiian Creole. We called it Pidgin, not like the bird, but like language. Fortunately for me, or maybe unfortunately for me, both of my parents had been educated on the East Coast. My mother was kind of a grammarian and strict. My father was an Army officer. So in addition to good posture at the dinner table, we had to have good English. Great, fine. I learned to answer the telephone when someone when someone asked for Connie, I answered, they would say, "Is Connie there?" And I would say, "This is she." I think I was the only 11-year-old kid on the entire island to answer the phone that way, but I did listen to my mother and follow the rules in the house. And then my brother, my sister, and I would go outside, go to school, and interact with our friends, with fishermen, with aunties, all of whom were speaking a completely different English. If you don't know what Hawaiian Creole is, it basically is a result of there being a beautiful, mellifluous Hawaiian language, which was the language of the indigenous people before Westerners arrived in Hawaii. And then American and English sailors came, and eventually merchants. Portuguese came, first whalers, and then Portuguese to work in the sugarcane plantation fields, and then Chinese and Japanese, and eventually Koreans and Filipinos, now Melanesians. So we have literally a melting pot of culturally and a melting pot linguistically. And what happens when you hear Pidgin, you probably haven't heard Pidgin, so I'll tell you a little Pidgin poem. You know, small kid time, so much more pretty nor a mountain. Why you fella went make the mountain like that? You think you more natural inside a box? It's a little ecological poem. It's like, remember when we were kids, the mountains were so beautiful. Why do you do that to the mountains? Do you think something is more beautiful than a box? So that's Pidgin English. It sounds, people say it sounds like Jamaican English. There are some misunderstandings about Pidgin, but basically it takes Hawaiian syntax and it strings English and then it takes sort of English sentences and combines it with Hawaiian syntax. And then we mix in words from all those other languages. So I literally grew up speaking a language that really wasn't syntactically English. Just to give you an example, for the past tense, where you would say in standard English, "I went to the store yesterday." In Pidgin, you would say, "Oh, yesterday, I went go store." So the way you do the past tense, "I went go," is the past tense of to go. So I grew up hearing these two Englishes, learning in school and from my parents that one was right and the other was wrong. And there always was this sort of whiff of scandal surrounding Pidgin English. And I say I grew up bilingual in English. And I think even before I was even aware of it consciously, I was aware that jokes were funnier in Pidgin, stories were livelier in Pidgin. I once was beaten at a storytelling contest in elementary school because I made the mistake of telling the lovely story of Tico and the Golden Wings in Standard English, and my competitor, Shah Bentos, told the story of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves in Pidgin, and he won because he knew his audience better. So I was always fascinated by that. And by the time I went to college, which I actually went to undergraduate at Princeton and was studying English literature, and I became very frustrated in the study of literature and the writing of poetry that all we ever talked about were themes and imagery and all this kind of brainy, cerebral stuff, and we never talked about the very things that made poetry poetry. We never talked about the music of words, the sound of lines, the rhythm in language, all of which seemed very important to me, and all of which are very important in Pidgin English. The way you enunciate something is as important as the words you use. So I brought this up with one of my professors, who happened to be an editor of the Norton Anthology of English Literature and a very kind of esteemed fellow. And we had this exchange once when I was sort of complaining about the way we talked about poetry. And he ended up giving me a challenge, and I tried to meet it. And then I kind of apologetically said, well, I grew up speaking Pidgin English. And he said, Pidgin what? What is that? And I said, well, I told him a sort of children's story in Pidgin English, and he loved it. And that was a seminal moment for me where I realized here I was, doesn't get more academy than the office of Professor Lawrence Lipkin at Princeton, and yet he was fascinated with Pidgin English. And in a way, that moment set me on my course as a writer and as a thinker of English, thinker of language, about language, for the rest of my career, which is, how can I understand language in a new way? I set out as a writer to try to understand English in a new way, not the way that English is taught in elementary school and high schools, not the way that Pidgin English and Black English and Spanglish are looked down upon by a lot of language mavens, but rather a way of approaching language where I could understand the underlying codes of English a little bit more and understand how to be a better writer and understand how to help other people be a better writer. So that's really where I'm coming from. I'm not a grammarian. I'm not a linguist. I sometimes have imposter syndrome because I really am not an academic and haven't studied this stuff as an academic. And as Liz mentioned, I have written 2 previous books about language. The first was called Wired Style when I was at Wired Magazine and was very interested in the way that technology was changing English. And again, the way geeks speak, what is this weird way of talking? Is that bad? Is slang and jargon bad? Or is it interesting? Well, to me, it's always interesting. And then Sin and Syntax, which really is a writing book. And then, darn it, I just had more questions about language. There were some questions that I wanted to ask myself. There was some research that I wanted to do. And I was fascinated. I had a hunch about verbs that I wanted to pursue. And 3 years and 300 pages later, here we are with Vex, Hex, Smash, Smooch. And what I thought I would share with you today are kind of a few of the motivating questions behind the book, and then the answers that I discovered in the course of my research, which included research into language evolution, linguistics, but also just into literature and into other languages as well, not just English, but other languages as well. So let me kind of walk through those questions and then give you some short answers and include a couple of readings to give you a sense of the kind of stuff that excites me. And then I'll happily have a discussion with you. I hope that I throw out some ideas that you disagree with, because I always think debates are more interesting than polite Q&A. So the first question that I had was, okay, I have this hunch that verbs are really important. Is that true? Are they as important as I say when I teach writing? I tell my students the first thing you should look at in a sentence is the verb for 2 reasons. 1, your sentence will be more dramatic if you work on your verbs, and number 2, a lot of the complicated stuff in the sentence that muddies up the sentence will get sorted out if you sort out your verb. So that was what I'd been saying for a number of years. So I went and I did some research, and one of the questions I had was like, are verbs really the most important word in the language? And were verbs the first word we spoke? I was like really hoping to find out that verbs came before nouns. Well, a number of books later, I can report that no, probably nouns. Actually, probably what came first were interjections, the forgotten words in English. Things like, psst, ouch, hey. Those words are probably, and this comes from a linguist at Tufts University, but probably if we can reconstruct how language evolved, the first words were interjections, which made somebody like me really excited because I always wondered why interjections work differently than any other part of speech, and I had a curiosity about that. Now I kind of know why. They're really a vestige from the time before language, the time before sentences, and they probably reflect our first utterances. But what about, was the first word a verb after interjections? Nah, it was probably a noun. If you look at babies and you look at the way we learn speech, the first things that babies say are nouns. Usually we like to name things. And then even if you look at literature, you look at creation myth. What does a creation myth do? It names everything in our universe. So in fact, many, many, many more words in the English language are nouns. We have many more nouns than verbs. Okay, so bummer. That one didn't work out. But verbs are 1/7 of our vocabulary, and they do come in right after nouns. So when linguists study babies and language acquisition, nouns do come first, and right away after that are verbs, because immediately babies need to want to express what they need and what they want to do. So they weren't the first word. I don't know if I can really say they were the most important word in English, but then I read closely Steven Pinker, the linguist and cognitive psychologist who's written The Language Instinct. And I found a sentence which, made my day, which was Steven Pinker, when he describes verbs, calls them little despots. In fact, that almost was the title of my book, Little Despots. Because when you really analyze a sentence, what you see, as Steven Pinker put it, it's the verbs boss everyone else in the sentence around. It's the verb that determines who the subject is. It's the verb that determines what the object is. And so if indeed you are trying to figure out a sentence and improve a sentence, you go to the verb first and figure out everything from there. So I was partially vindicated. When Steven Pinker calls them the most important word in the sentence, I feel like, okay, cool, I was right. So that was question number one. How important are they? How much of our vocabulary do they make up? They're not necessarily the most common words, but when it comes to sentences, the verb is the linchpin, the heartbeat of a sentence. So that was something that was confirmed for me. The next question, this might seem weird to you unless some of you, like I, have studied a lot of writing and studied a lot of English, but have any of you read, for example, in George Orwell's Politics in the English Language, or in Strunk and White, or in William Zinzer's On Writing Well, this idea that we should favor Anglo-Saxon words? Does that resonate with them? Have you read this in writing books? Almost every book you read on writing will tell you to favor Anglo-Saxon words. That was question number two. Why? Why? I don't speak Anglo-Saxon. Do you speak Anglo-Saxon? We haven't been speaking Anglo-Saxon for 1,000 years. A lot of stuff has happened in 1,000 years to the English language. Why is everybody telling me to prefer Anglo-Saxon words? So I went back and I did a bunch of research on that question. And it turns out it's just a myth, pure and simple. It's a myth. We have today somewhere between 450,000 and 1 million words in English. I know that's a huge range, and linguists disagree on how many words, but let's say we have 600,000 words in English today. It's a good medium. About 4,500 of them come from Anglo-Saxon. So just doing the numbers game, my question is answered. Why, when we have a rich trove of 600,000 words, would we want to prefer 4,000 of them or 4,500 of them? And indeed, there is just this myth that Anglo-Saxon is the root of English. Anglo-Saxon, by the way, is the language that was spoken between about 500 AD and 1000 AD in the British Isles. That was Anglo-Saxon. And it was a product of, the first people that came to England. Well, the first people were like in the Stone Age and the Iron Age. We don't really know too much about them. But the Celts came over from France and from the continent, and then the Romans came up during the Roman Empire, and then when the Vikings kept coming down and raiding. And so before the Angles and the Saxons ever got to England, English was already some Celtic, some Latin, some Scandinavian. That was the language being spoken. Then when the Romans receded, things got kind of woolly and rough, and so the Angles and the Saxons came in from Germany and Denmark and some Jutes, and they brought their language and their swords with them and kind of pushed the Celts into Wales and into the Highlands, and conquered English and brought their language, which was a Germanic language. So we went from sort of Celtic and Latin and Scandinavian to Anglo-Saxon being a Germanic language. And our English is essentially a Germanic language. It's not a Romance language. But at the same time, Romans kept coming up, St. Augustine, people kept coming up from Rome, and Latin kept mixing in with English. And then in about 1066, William the Conqueror came over from Normandy, and our language changed to French and Latin mostly. So by 1066, you have, residue of Celtic, Scandinavian, lots of freckle is a Scandinavian word. Love the word freckle. What's the matter with that? Cake, good word, Scandinavian. Why wouldn't we want to use cake? Prefer the Anglo-Saxon, don't use cake. I think you're supposed to use biscuit or something. So basically what I want to impart to you is that by 1066 and a century or so afterwards, English was this incredible mix of different languages from all over the continent. And there were words were pulled, and syntactic elements were pulled from all these languages. And then things kind of settled down, the invasion stopped, and English kind of cooked for a few centuries, just kind of a stew that simmered. And that was Anglo-Saxon, that was Old English. That Old English was really before the Norman invasion. So then we have early modern English. So this idea, have I convinced you? This is it's like every time you see that, every time you hear a writer tell you to prefer Anglo-Saxon words, ask the writer to name one. Dog is, I'll ask you, dog and cat. One of those is Anglo-Saxon. One of them is Latin, from Latin. Do you know which is which? Dog is what? Anglo-Saxon. Dog is Anglo-Saxon. Cat, like chat in French or gato in Spanish, is from Latin. So it's like they're both 3 words. They're both pretty economical. They're both pretty common. Why is dog a better word than cat? It's not. So that was one. I felt pretty happy to be able to dismiss that. And there was a reason that I was unhappy about that myth, because it implies that there are certain kind of words that are better. It implies that that there's this kind of set of English words that are better than others. And my whole philosophy is to appreciate and celebrate the diversity and the richness of English, the incredible number of synonyms that we have, and in writing to use the full palette of English. So I think that tendency of writing teachers to tell you that some words are better than others, I think is just wrong-headed, and I was very glad to be able to disprove it in all kinds of numerical and historical ways. So that was kind of question number 2 and how I arrived at the answer. And I thought, just to give you a sense of why and how we don't want to think this way, I thought I would go back and read a little bit of Chaucer, go all the way back to Chaucer, which was written in Anglo-Saxon, so this is actually translated. But listen to let's just listen to the very beginning of the Canterbury Tales, which should be fairly familiar to everybody. And if you could listen for the verbs, and then I'll talk about them for a second. Remember, this is very early on in the evolution of English. It's considered Middle English. When in April the sweet showers fall and pierce the drought of March to the root, and all the veins are bathed in liquor of such power as brings about the engendering of the flower. Upon the tender shoots and the young sun his half course in the sign of the ram has run, and the small fowl are making melody, then people long to go on pilgrimages, and palmers long to seek the stranger strands of far-off saints, hallowed in sundry lands. And specially from every shire's end of England, down to Canterbury they wend, to seek the holy blissful martyr, quick to give help to them when they were sick. So now, just taking that beautiful passage, familiar passage of Middle English, we already have a lot of great verbs, by the way, wend and bathed and engendering. But those verbs come from Old English, they come from Anglo-French, they come from Latin, Greek, German, and Scandinavian. And that's just Middle English. We haven't even gotten started, really, by then. Shakespeare hasn't even come on the scene. So that was sort of question number 2, why this idea of Anglo-Saxon being better than anything else? Question number 3 had to do with what makes English different from other languages. Because actually some things that I discovered in terms of the role of verbs and stuff is pretty similar in every language. But what makes English in particular different? And a lot of it comes from this linguistic history of so many invasions. And of course, once the invasion stopped in English, then we started going out all over the world and conquering. And so Indian words and Spanish words and Native American words were brought into the English language in the second millennium. So what makes English different? And why do we have certain patterns? In particular, I have always been fascinated by our habit of redundancy. I know we have some editors in the crowd. Whenever I am editing a text, I have a pattern that I notice called cease and desist, call it, where this habit that people have of using 2 words when one would do. And in editing, it doesn't matter whether it's nouns or adjectives or verbs. I find this all the time. I'm like, why are we always so redundant? And when does it serve us and when does it not? Well, a lot of the reason that we have this I think, and this is just a personal theory, as I said, I'm not a linguist, but we do have this pattern of redundancy that comes from that Middle English period, or that period of the Norman invasion where we had 3 languages being spoken simultaneously in England. There was Anglo-Saxon, spoken by the average person. There was Latin and French spoken in government and in the law. And so interestingly, we ended up with a whole bunch of doublets, and sometimes triplets, they call them, linguistic doublets, where you say something, you pull 1 word from English and 1 word from Latin, or 1 word from English and 1 word from French. And that way you know that you'll always be understood, especially in a court of law. This is why lawyers are so long-winded. We ended up getting pairs like last will and testament. Testament being Latin, last will being Anglo-Saxon. Null and void. And this habit became so popular that sometimes they pulled 2 English words. Sometimes they pulled 2 Latin words. And this sort of got encoded in the language. And then that doesn't mean it's right, though. So still as an editor, I did want to understand why it's done. And I wanted to understand that why sometimes in an oral tradition or in an oral context, look at the speeches of Martin Luther King, for example. You see a lot of repetition there. And as a rhetorical device, repetition is really useful. But then in a written context, it's really pernicious. It ends up flattening out sentence, deadening things. Saying something twice is actually half as effective as saying it once. But anyway, that was the explanation, and that was an interesting bit of research. The other fascinating thing to me about English is our history of compounding, and this is different in English from other languages. So this started round about Chaucer, even a little before Chaucer, where sometimes we would take a French prefix and smash it onto an Anglo-Saxon suffix, and we'd get a word like beguile, for example. Sometimes we would blend 2 words together, mash 2 words together. Great example of this in today's world is baseball. It started out as a kind of ball you played on bases, and baseball became 1 word. So that's what linguists call compounding. Really common in English. We have always loved to smash words together. And so I love learning that it goes way, way, way back. Because you'll see language, people like me who write books on language and write columns for the New York Times on language, some of them sit there and fret and wring their hands over all these words like stumble upon. Why would you call a business a stumble upon, or iPhone, or this tendency of taking prefixes and smashing them on and creating new words. And a lot of people look down on that. We've been doing that forever. That is a characteristic of English, and to me, I think it's fascinating to see it. It's very alive right now, particularly in technology. A lot of compounding going on. But for those who sort of tisk about that, I just send them back to Chaucer or Shakespeare. Now, getting to Shakespeare, we've got to get to Shakespeare. Because what happens in Elizabethan English in Shakespeare's time is sort of the third. So I'm drilling down into this one question of what makes English different. One is this kind of habit of redundancy, this pattern of redundancy, which has very good sort of understandable historical roots. One is compounding, which we do a lot of, and the third is invention. We in English love to invent words, and we always have loved to invent words. And this Shakespeare being the absolute master of this. But the other thing that's cool about English, and is different from other languages, is that in English we can take a noun and turn it into a verb. We can take an adjective and turn it into a noun. Words slide around in English. And again, Shakespeare was is one of my favorite examples of this, because it was he who invented the phrase "dog him at the heels." Wait, dog is a noun. How can you use it as a verb? Well, it was in Hamlet, or spanieled, I think, spanieled him. Season your admiration, Henry Bolingbroke said. So season being a noun, but all of a sudden it's being turned into a verb. And this, some people call it, I forget what they call it, like form shifting, where you take a word that's from one part of speech and you use it as another part of speech, goes all the way back to Chaucer. It is part of what we do in English. And I think it's important to understand this for two reasons. One is, again, a lot of people, I'm sure you've heard it, impact is not a verb, it's a noun. It's like, so what? We do that in English, So first of all, a lot of people think that this is, a lot of people act like they know something more than you do by saying, oh, that's not a noun, it's a verb. We've done this all the time in English. We do it with great abandon in great literature. So that's a bullshit rule. I love bullshit rules. But the other reason that it's really important to understand this is the idea of invention and creativity. So Shakespeare created metaphors by taking verbs and taking words and using them in a different way. And our best writers do that today too. One of my favorite passages in all of contemporary journalism is a description of catching by Roger Angell in The New Yorker. And he talks about that thing that catchers do, I can't even do it very well, but what the signals that catchers make at the plate. And he describes a catcher semaphoring a plan. Well, I guarantee you semaphoring is not a verb. It's a noun. But it's exactly, we didn't have a word for that thing that catchers do. And he thought of signaling systems and invented the word semaphoring. In the same passage, he talks about the focus of people in the stands zoom lensing onto the pitcher. Again, not a verb, but a perfect verb in that particular context. And he's just continuing on in the tradition of Shakespeare. Muhammad Ali is another one of my exemplars of this kind of crazy use of language. It's wrong. It's kind of grammatically wrong, but it's syntactically perfect. This tendency to play with language, to invent new words, to take verbs and use them as nouns is alive and well today, and it should be. For each of these things, though, there's kind of a good use and a bad use. So, for example, with this idea of synonyms, we have all these synonyms. We have such a rich language, so we should use all of them. No. We should use the best verb, the most precise verb, a verb that our audience understands, a verb that, if possible, has great sounds, nice rhythm, works with other words in the sentence to create beauty. So I'm not in favor of any old word, even if it's a big dictionary word. So I would, never encourage you to use a word like disintermediate or institutionalization or utilization. So there, while at the same time I kind of celebrate the rich palette that we have in English, I think discrimination has to be what we use to determine which word we use in a particular sentence. And the worst habit that most writers have is they just don't think of the possibilities. They just use the first word that pops into their head. And I'm going to give you all a little test right now to give you a barometer of how this works. I'm going to think of the most common word that I can, and I want you just to take a few minutes to think of, to let some synonyms pop into your head. And if you can jot them down, go ahead. But just riff for a few seconds on the word talk and think of as many synonyms as you can. Okay, so let me tell you the ones that I came up with when I gave myself about this much time this morning. Gossip, debate, chatter, banter, converse, post, like talking online. And then palaver, which is one of those kind of $64,000 words that you want to pull out every now and then if you want to impress someone. But then there's slang. Did anybody get slang? Yada, yada, yada. Diss, rap, tweet out. Or metaphors, like, or cliches, unleash a torrent. Did anybody have one that was super good? Yes.
Chinwag.
Pardon me?
Chinwag.
Chinwag. Any others?
Loquate.
Loquate. Nice Latinate verb if you're trying to impress someone. Any others? Any good ones? Any metaphors? Anyway, this is, pardon me?
Babble.
Babble, sure. So this is the idea. And actually, if you stop when you're writing and you give yourself 10 seconds to just think about a common verb, like, wait, is that the best one? The more you practice this, and I think of writing as a practice, almost like yoga is a practice, the more you practice this, the better your verbal, your kind of natural thesaurus becomes. Even better is to take 20 seconds and walk yourself over to a real thesaurus and come up with some alternatives, or a dictionary, and not the dictionary ones. The ones online, I haven't found one I like yet. But if you actually do this as a matter of course, as a matter of writing practice, not only does your writing become better, but you become better at it naturally, and the better words pop into your head on the first go. So what makes English, in my view, what makes English different and kind of special in a way? Our ability to be incredibly precise, our ability to have such a choice among different alternatives that we can build rhythm and sound into sentences that we maybe didn't even think of when we were just pulling the first word that pops into our head. And then the ability to be inventive with words, that there is this long tradition of invention with words. And each of these things comes with kind of a red flag or a cautionary note that you always want to do them selectively and intelligently and with a sense of play, too. And I think that the sense of play is what's often lost when we talk about making our writing better. So obviously my book goes through many, many more questions. There are 12 chapters, and each chapter was motivated by a central question, and each chapter also sets about to debunk one myth, like prefer the Anglo-Saxon. So there's a lot more than this in the book, but I wanted to end on the point of the book and the point of sin and syntax as well, which isn't good grammar, which isn't sort of one-upsman, giving you the ability to play one-upsmanship with your colleagues or your family, but rather to understand what makes writing and speaking and all communication work. And the end point of all this is not good grammar, but rather great literary style. And so I spend some time in the book defining literary style, and which I define as a writer who has a great style or is a stylist is able to mirror in the sentences, mirror in the word choice, mirror in the sentences, mirror in the music of the language, the very action or character or event that writer is describing. So when you kind of absorb all these lessons, you develop the ability to influence a reader emotionally. You're almost like the puppeteer behind the puppets. It's almost manipulative, the way you can manipulate or cause in your reader a certain emotional reaction just through the words that you use and the way you string them along on the page. And as an example, one of my favorite examples of this idea of literary style, I thought I would end today by reading a passage from a short story by Joanne Beard, who's a contemporary author. The short story is called Cousins, and it begins with the narrator's mother and her sister sitting on a lake before dawn in rural Illinois fishing. And I want to read you these passages, and I want you to notice what happens with the language, and in particular the verbs. Now, one thing I didn't focus on today, but it is a focus of 2 entire chapters in the book, is the difference between what I call static verbs and dynamic verbs. So static verbs being verbs like is and was and were, but also verbs like appears and remains, which are often the verbs that we use most naturally in sentences, and they're the verbs that writers like me who rewrite go back and take out of sentences. And so the key to writing with verbs is to Use static verbs when you want things to be quiet or when you want the attention in a sentence to be on the nouns, but to use dynamic verbs when you want to enliven scenes, cast a character, or bring drama into your sentences. So this is a great example, I think, of a writer who completely understands this difference between static verbs and dynamic verbs and when you use each. Here is a scene. Two sisters are fishing together in a flat-bottomed boat on an olive green lake. They sit slumped like men, facing in opposite directions, drinking coffee out of a metal-sided thermos, smoking intently. Without their lipstick, they look strangely weary and passive, like pale replicas of their real selves. They both have a touch of morning sickness, but neither is admitting it. Instead, they watch their bobbers and argue about worms versus minnows. It is 5 a.m. A duck stands up, shakes out its feather, and peers above the still grass at the edge of the water. The skin of the lake twitches suddenly, and a fish springs loose into the air, drops back down with a flat splash. Ripples move across the surface like radio waves. The sun hoists itself up and gets busy, laying a sparkling rug across the water, burning the beads of dew off the reeds, baking the tops of our mothers' heads. One puts on sunglasses and the other a plaid fishing cap with a wide brim. In the cold, dark underwater, a long fish with a tattered tail discovers something interesting. He circles once and then has his breakfast before becoming theirs. As he breaks from the water to the air, he twists hard, sending out a cold spray, sparks of green light. My aunt reels him in, triumphant, and grins at her sister, big teeth in a friendly mouth. What I love about this piece is that it starts out before dawn, two women sitting in a boat, waiting. And the verbs echo that. There are a lot of static verbs, are fishing together. They look strangely weird. Look is a static verb, actually. And it is 5 a.m. So the verbs are quiet. Everything's holding still. Nothing's happening. And then right after it is 5 a.m., a duck stands up, shakes out its feather, and peers. So it's the verbs that get the story going. And what we have is the whole scene. As the day wakes up, the scene wakes up, the verbs wake up. And then it's not just dynamic verbs, but who of us would write, the sun hoists itself up and gets busy? Most of us would stop at rise, right? The sun rises. And yet that ability to animate the sun, to imagine, to find a word that is different and that is so perfect for what she's describing, that's what I mean by style. So not just using a dynamic verb, but actually using a verb that no one else would use. And then, of course, who can forget that description of the fish who circles once and then has his breakfast before becoming theirs. As he breaks from the water to the air, he twists hard, sending out a cold spray and twists and sparks of green light. So that idea, if I could leave you with that idea of twisting hard, that to me is what verbs and supercrafted sentences allow us to do in our writing. So I'll stop there and take your questions. I'm sure there's a lot more to talk about. And yes. Yes.
What's the title of the talk mean?
What is the so from the verbs from the swamp to Squidoo, that's basically the arc that I trace in the book. So the book, as I said, is 12 chapters, and it goes from prehistory, so the swamp, I go all the way back to the swamp and talk about amoeba and fish and language evolution, so what we learn from language evolution. And then I end on very contemporary language, and I end looking at social media and the language of conversation today. So that's the arc of the book, is kind of from the before language even began, and that's the first chapter, to tweets and song lyrics and social media brand names today. So that was the idea there. Yes?
So one of the things we do in English is we take a pre-existing verb and we add a little preposition on the end.
Yes.
Like by or from or up.
Yes.
There's just so many things that have blank up. Is that done in other languages, and why do we do it?
Why do we do anything? But it's really interesting. I have a whole chapter. These are called phrasal verbs. So these are verbs that start out life as normal verbs, and then through time, over time, we end up adding prepositions or adverbs after them. And those preposition adverbs become known as particles because they're sort of part of the verb. One of the verbs with the longest entry in the Oxford English Dictionary is set. And you think set, but if you think of particles, you get set on, set to, set upon, set about. So particles, basically when you add them, they change the meaning of the verb. And the verb plus the particle has a different meaning than the original verb. This, interestingly enough, only started a couple hundred years ago. In fact, in Samuel Johnson's dictionary in 1755 or 56, whatever it was, he kind of is troubled by these things. He doesn't even know what to call them. And they didn't even have a name until early in the 20th century when the guy who the first editor, the most important editor of the Oxford English Dictionary, decided to call them phrasal verbs. So they're very interesting and they're very contemporary. They're more common in English. They are an English phenomenon. I can't really speak to other languages, but and what's fascinated me is how common they are in technology. So, for example, log on, and a lot of brand names, stumble upon, tweet out. Tweet out is a phrasal verb because tweet is the verb in that sense. Of course, it started as a noun, and tweet out some people even close that up. So there's something contemporary about it. That it's a relatively new phenomenon in the English language, and they are increasing in usage and diversity.
Thanks.
Yes.
You mentioned compound verbs as a unique facet or as one of the things that makes English special. These also occur in other languages, for example, they're common in German. What makes them different in English?
Well, I don't I'm not a linguist, so I haven't compared them to other languages, but it's just that English being a Germanic language, that makes sense. We do compounding. All I have to do is look at street names in Germany, and you know that they do a lot of compounding. You know, the words that go on for a mile. So it's not. I don't know how they're different from English to German, but the point is that we do it a lot. And the reason that I care about this, most people wouldn't care at all, but I spent a lot of time at Wired thinking about things like, is tweet out one word or two? Is log on one word or two? Is email hyphenated or not? Is website, actually if you're a copy editor, I know there's some editors in the house, as a copy editor, you really sweat over these things, and you wouldn't believe the arguments people have over whether or not there should be a hyphen in email, whether website, should start with a capital W. So my interest in them isn't so much in how English is different, but rather that this is a phenomenon in English. It goes way back. We compound very easily, and so while I appreciate some sticklers wanting us to be careful about language, and I do agree that we should be careful about language, the truth is that language changes pretty quickly, and English changes very quickly, and so I think it's just an interesting thing to note that it's an old tradition in English, and it didn't start with email or tweet out. Yes?
To go back to an earlier point where you began, there's a lot of compounding that happens in Hawaiian.
Oh boy, Hawaiian's all about compounding. In fact, they don't even have verbs in Hawaiian. In Hawaiian, do you know Hawaiian? So Hawaiian, a lot of the way to create a verb in Hawaiian is to take a noun and stick ho'o on it. Ho'o. And so ikaika in Hawaiian is strong, and there's a very common boy's name, ikaika. But ho'o ikaika is to make strong. That's how you say go to the gym. Ho'o ikaika. In computer, it's very interesting. In the Hawaiian language immersion schools, they have an interesting problem because the Hawaiian language was more or less frozen in 1896, and then a huge effort to revise it started in 1984. So they started teaching Hawaiian in schools, but then they're using computers. So it's like, how do you say upload in Hawaiian? How do you say computer in Hawaiian? Well, the way they made upload is they thought, okay, there's this word uka, which means the uplands. Ka uka is the uplands. And uka is up. So if you say ho'o uka, it's to put something up. So you ho'o uka a saddle onto a horse, and you ho'o uka a suitcase into the back of your car, and you ho'o uka a file onto the internet. But it's ho'o. They have markers. They're called markers. So in Hawaiian, a lot of the way a verb is changed, you take a verb marker and you just attach it to a noun. So yeah, yes.
I lived for a while on the Navajo Nation, which is a verb-driven language. So it's interesting when they come to invent new words, like the cell phone, they use a verb.
Interesting.
It's walking around, because people would often walk and talk on the phone. Rather than, so it's interesting that the verb is variations in verbs. If I were to give you a pencil, it would be one verb, give. If I were to give you a paper, it would be a
different
word, give, because it's loose rather than rigid.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
if I give you a leash for an animal, that would be different than giving you a rope, because it's an animal attached.
Yeah.
So the variation of verb, and the children learn verbs first.
Right, and the noun is embedded in the verb, is what you said. Rather than having a verb and an object, as we do in English, the noun is almost embedded.
The
Yeah.
noun tells you what.
That's so interesting. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that something was grammatically wrong but syntactically perfect. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Yes. Okay, I was thinking about a particular speech of Muhammad Ali's before the rumble in the jungle in 1974. He was going to face George Foreman, and someone in the press corps asked him, "Are you ready for the fight?" And he said, "Am I ready?" I want to get this right. It's in Sin and Syntax. I'm ready. I'm bad. I'm going to get the quote wrong, but he says, "Only last night I injured a stone, injured a stone, murdered a rock. No, only last night I injured a stone, hospitalized a brick, murdered a rock. I'm so bad, I make medicine sick." So you're like, is that grammatical? Can you injure a stone? Like, can you hospitalize a brick? And yet it's brilliant, and it's syntactically perfect. And if you analyze the speech, if you diagram the sentences, it goes subject, verb, object, verb, object, subject, linking verb, object, complement. It's syntactically brilliant. There are no extraneous words. It is parallel structure to the nines. It even rhymes. And it's crazy. Nobody would say that, yet we know what he means. So that, is it grammatically perfect? No, because you don't injure a stone. We don't do that. And yet we know what he means. And so to me, that's in that great tradition of Shakespeare and Mark Twain and Muhammad Ali, this kind of upending the language or being really subversive and not following the rules the way we're taught them. And yet actually underneath it, they're totally following the rules that matter, which is the way words are relate to each other in a sentence. I think there was a hand all the way in the back that I missed you earlier. Yes.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to ask you about you talked about words being Anglo-Saxon or Latin or French or having all of these origins, and I think it's really interesting to consider that in light of the fact that English is it's not English anymore. It doesn't really belong to England per se. But it's evolved into a global language. Yet we still feel the need to assign the words that we utilize an origin that is distinctive to a place. And almost as if to legitimize what we're speaking. And I guess you could explain that kind of as a human need to have a historical context for what you're doing. But like, where do you think that, even in a world where this language is global in every sense of the word, why do we still feel the need to confine it to, like, a particular place or do this?
Well, that's interesting that you see it that way, because I think of etymology differently. To me, I'm fascinated by the origin of words, partly because if you understand the origin of a word, sometimes you understand a lot of nuances in the word. So from the origin comes the nuance. Let me give you an example. The word decimate. Okay? Oh, man, he just is like, they decimated, blah, 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 you know. We use it all the time. And we use it as a synonym for annihilate. Usually, when we use it. You know, totally destroy. That's how we use it. But you know, the word has the root D-E-C-I. And in Latin, that's 10, deca, in Latin and Greek. And it actually comes from a practice in the Roman army where I believe after a loss or a mutiny, I could get this, be slightly corrected on this, 1/10 of the troops would be killed. So the word decimate literally meant kill 1/10. And so for me, that's very interesting. It's what makes decimate different from annihilate. And I actually want to preserve that meaning. I want to use decimate when I mean decimate and annihilate when I mean annihilate because it preserves nuance in the language. So that's why I'm interested in etymology. And also just, I'm interested in etymology because certain words sound like, for example, the word bungalow, which I love the word bungalow. What a better word than house. Most of us would just write house. And we could have cottage, Tudor, Victorian, bungalow. I love the word bungalow. It comes from Hindi. And I like knowing that it comes from Hindi because bungalow has kind of a different rhythm and a different sound than a lot of English words. And why? Well, because it comes from this different language. So for me, it explains a lot of the color and nuance in the language, and also it helps us differentiate words. So that's why I'm interested in it. But I can completely understand that for some people it might be a process of legitimization. And certainly words that come from Latin and Greek have this imprimatur of betterness, which I reject because I think they're terrible. I mean, they usually clutter and make language really academic and boring. And yet people use words like that when they're trying to sound academic or sound highfalutin. What was the wonderful one that you gave us? Loquate?
Loquate, which I intentionally used to alienate people who aren't supposed to understand it.
Excellent. That's when you want to use them. So anyway, two different ways probably to think about it. Did you? Yes, you had a hand up here. Yes.
Yeah, when I was learning English and grammar, I always felt there's this huge gap between spoken English and written English.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I wanted your thoughts about where is that headed now? I mean, do you feel that they're coming together, or that the divergence is getting greater, or does it even matter?
I resist any attempt ever, with the exception of phrasal verbs, which I can say those are relatively new in the language. My research, and part of what I was trying to express today, is that the stuff that we think is new isn't usually new. And there's always been this relationship between spoken and written language. So if you look at Shakespeare as an example of one of our best writers in this language, he was writing for the stage. He was writing for stuff to be spoken. And yet it was poetry, and it was an iambic pentameter and all that. But that was actually spoken language. And most writers will tell you that they read their writing out loud, or they'll encourage you to, most writing teachers will encourage students to write as they speak because it's more natural and it's easier for a reader, an audience, to hear it. So there's this very interesting interchange or relationship between the spoken and the written. And often when we write, it ends up being too written and too academic, and so we try to be more like speech, but then there's a great quote by T.S. Eliot who says, those who say that writing should be like speaking, don't know what they talk about because, again, I'm going to mangle the quote, but it's like We want writing to be more elevated. We want writing to be beautiful. It's worth working a little bit on your sentences. Writing should be more beautiful. It needs to be more alive and beautiful because it's on the page. There's a barrier. Flip side, spoken language can be so loose, so imprecise. I mean, of course, when we're speaking, we have gestures and tone of voice and all kinds of things to make the language more interesting, to make what we're saying more interesting. But all of us, I think, have a tendency to be too loose in spoken language. And do we have any Deadwood fans in the crowd? 'Cause I just loved, it was an HBO series from a couple of years ago, and the mayor of the town, E.B. Farnham, was this really somewhat, he would use a verb like loquate probably, but he used it, it sounded right. And I remember listening, it was really Shakespearean language that he spoke. And I remember one time, owned a hotel, and the widow Garrett lived in the hotel. And so one time he was at his desk in the lobby of the hotel, and the widow Garrett starts coming down the stairs, and he goes, "She enters." And I thought, oh man, everybody else would say, "There she is." And how wonderful that he used a verb. And I had a professor, I went to J school here at UC Berkeley, and one of my professors was Bernard Taper, who was a wonderful New Yorker writer, and wrote the biography of Valentine. And one time he was talking about the New Yorker, and I don't even remember what the sentence was, but he says, "I lament this change." Most of us would say, "I'm sad about that." So, our best speakers we love to listen to, I think we happen to have a very good orator in our president right now. His speech is really good. He speaks well. He speaks in good sentences. So I think it's more fungible. I see them as rightly influencing each other. And writing, I think, a lot of people say, "Oh, English is going to hell in a handbasket." Emails, everybody misspells in emails. It's like, email isn't writing. Email is email. Tweets are tweets. There's this other thing now. There's like writing, speaking, and this online communication. And to sort of see English going to hell in a handbasket because people don't use spell check enough seems to be very wrong-headed. And also I think that it's great that so many people are writing email, because I think in some ways email is teaching us to write more like we speak, more as we speak. So I see that as a very positive phenomenon. So I just try not to think of everything as like it used to be this way and now it's this way and it used to be good then and it's not so good. How can you possibly say that? We have so many more people who are literate now than were literate 100 years ago. I just don't see how you could possibly say we're behind. But anyway, I grew up in Hawaii on the beach. I have an inside-out way of looking at all this stuff. So now I've ended where we started, and I'm happy to stay and answer any more questions if you'd like, or talk to you about my books. But thank you so much for